Welcome to day 3 of our walk with Ben Anderson. We start at the crossroads between the Royal Mile and the mound under the gaze of David Hume's statue. We are at the point of the last public execution in Edinburgh when George Bryce was hanged.
Well, George Bryce murdered his 2 young sons. He threw them into a quarry. They were drowned, and I've had it say that 2 nights or so before his execution, he had a wonderful conversion. He said that he deserved all that he got, and he prayed that the Lord Jesus Christ would have mercy upon his soul, and that he hoped that when he was hanged that his spirit would go to heaven.
The plaque's actually marking it just here, is it? That's
yes.
The very spot.
Yes, the very spot where he was hanged. Yes, indeed it is.
Just a few hundred yards down the road, we come to St. Giles Cathedral. With over 1 million visitors per year, it must be one of the most visited landmarks in Edinburgh. And it did, of course, play a pivotal role in the spiritual history of Edinburgh.
Well, the first church on the site was possibly between 1124 and 1138. There are some historians who think that possibly there was a church there much earlier than that, probably around about 850 AD, but that's not absolutely certain. The earliest church in Edinburgh would possibly be on the site of the present-day St. Cuthbert's Church, which was founded by either Cuthbert or one of his followers. But we do know that David I, one of the sons of Malcolm Canmore and Queen Margaret, established a church on this site about that time. Now that church it extended until probably the middle of the 14th century, but in 1385 the church was very badly damaged by the army or the soldiers of Richard II of England. It was rebuilt again, and we find that it was enlarged several times. In 1829 there was a massive restoration, and again in the 1870s there was a very large restoration. This flat ashlar slab was placed on top of the medieval rubble, which has very disappointingly taken away the medieval outlook of the church. However, the important part, so far as we're concerned, is that in 1637, when Bishop Laud read the Book of Common Prayer, the Scottish Book of Common Prayer, which was introduced to the kingdom as a pointer towards Episcopalianism, an Edinburgh street wife, probably a vegetable seller, cried out in broad Scots, which is more emphatic than English, really. She cried out, "Fos Lún, dost thou say mass at my lug?" and threw the stool at the bishop. And of course there was a riot within the church itself and a riot outside too. And that was eventually followed, of course, by the 1638 Scottish National Covenant. Now, before that, in 1559, John Knox was appointed minister of St. Giles and ministered here until 1572. And this would have been the great preaching place of the Scottish Reformation. It was here that Knox thundered, whereas the Magdalen Chapel was where the planning was carried out. It was here that the preaching took place. This is very central to Presbyterianism and to the Reformation in Scotland. Here that Knox preached before the citizens of Edinburgh, before the lords of the congregation, and probably once or twice before Mary and Darnley. Darnley, of course, being Mary Stuart's second husband. That is actually recorded. And we all know, of course, that Presbyterianism is the state denomination for Scotland, and the American government is based on the form of Presbyterian church government. The church today is visited by people from all over the world, but unfortunately in the 1829 restoration there was a wonderful 12th century arch which remained from the 1385 burning, and it was completely demolished. The entrance to the church at that time would be probably at the far end here, as indeed it was.
Behind me is the Marks Brace shop, that turquoise coloured one there, just a stone's throw on the other side from St. Giles Cathedral. And that is a historical site of the Edinburgh City Mission. David Naismith came over from Glasgow in 1832 and met with some businessmen in that place and founded the Edinburgh City Mission. The Edinburgh City Mission, along with the other city missions in those days, were very radical. David Naismith established about 60, not just in Britain, but also in Europe and America, including also setting up the YMCA. But in this particular spot, he was very keen to see that the message of Christ, both in word and deed, could be taken all over the heart of our city, particularly beginning here. See, in those days in the 19th century, the side streets along here were quite notorious for a lot of poverty, a lot of alcoholism, and children running wild around these streets. So when David Naismith came, he had a slogan which was, "May the glory of God and the salvation of souls be your chief, your only end." And he caused a bit of a stir setting up here, because some of the ministers thought that his approach was a bit sort of undignified, and he was not a clergyman as such. And he was saying that Edinburgh is not a Christian city. He said, "Go with me down into the slums and see what you make of it there. And we need to take the gospel to the darkest parts of the city." He also said, "Well, let's make ordinary men and women missionaries." And again, some people were offended by that, thinking it should be the work of a man in a dog collar or something. But thirdly, he said, "Let's unite the Christians together, because the job's too big for any one group to do it." So some people said that's impossible, because at the time people were arguing about doctrinal things in the 19th century here. But he cut right through that, because he said, "It's for the glory of God and the salvation of souls, that's our focus." And so they pursued. About 40 or so years later, there were 130 missionaries working together for a population of about 200,000 here. Now, there were 33 of them actually working with Edinburgh City Mission, but the rest, many of them had been inspired by the work of Edinburgh City Mission, and so there were church-based missionaries, other mission societies sort of sprouted up in that time. And it was a real purple time of mission in our city, and very holistic as well. And the missionaries would go into the dark places, often on some of these side streets where there were brawls on a Friday or Saturday night. A missionary would turn up, and all the men would scurry off like sort of cockroaches into the darkness. But he would know, the missionaries would know all the places where the local hideouts were, so nothing could escape the missionaries, and they would go down a side street, little corner somewhere, and there would be the men hiding, cowering from the light of the missionary, and he would start preaching to them. And it was very radical, and often many of the people were converted. Back in 1841, there was quite an extraordinary Christian revival down at the Grass Market in a place called the Shelter, which was run by some Christian ladies for women who had come out of prostitution and were living quite a rough lifestyle. And the missionaries were invited to come and preach on a rota basis down there. And there were quite extraordinary scenes of women breaking out in tears of repentance as the missionaries spoke. And that prepared the way for an 1859 to 61 revival, which impacted the whole of this area. And the missionaries with Edinburgh City Mission were working very closely with Carruber's Close Mission in that time, and seeing a harvest of thousands of people coming to the kingdom of God. And at the time, at its peak later on in the 19th century, the council and indeed the government often would come to Edinburgh City Mission for advice on sanitary conditions, work with the poor, and it was really effective ministry in those days.
As we move farther down the Royal Mile, Bill tells us more about the troubled history of Edinburgh.
Well, we're in Advocates Close, and the buildings on my right here are possibly among the oldest buildings in Edinburgh, surviving the burning of part of the city by Henry VIII's army in 1542. Cromwell actually climbed the spiral staircase to view his fleet and the fort. And I'm looking directly at the monument to Sir Walter Scott, designed by George Meikle Kemp, who was a joiner. There was a competition for a monument to be erected to Sir Walter Scott, and his plan was accepted. Kemp was a fine Christian man, and unfortunately he fell into the Forth and Clyde Canal and was drowned.
We cross back over the Royal Mile, and we are now walking around the back of St Giles, where we come to Parliament Square.
This is the home of the Supreme Court and the Scottish Court Service. From here, you can see another part of Parliament House we talked about yesterday. The ground was originally St. Giles' Kirkyard, and Bill tells us about one very important person who is buried under parking lot 23.
Now, by tradition, that's the burying place of John Knox. By 1560, the old churchyard of St. Giles, or rather 1558, the old churchyard of St. Giles was full, and the problem was a new burying ground. So the Queen Regent, Mary of Lorraine, gave the city a new graveyard, actually, which was the large ground near the Greyfriars Priory. Now, the last person to be buried in this, what was St. Giles' Churchyard, was John Knox, as minister of the church here. It is thought that a space was reserved for his burial, and it was there that he was buried in 1572. Thousands of people gathered round the churchyard and the church itself that day that Knox was buried. Now, on the right of the traffic of the parking places here is the High Court of Justiciary, built 1825, 1827. The facade is classical Georgian, of course, and it hides the Parliament Hall of 1634, wherein the Covenantal trials took place, as already mentioned, and in 1707, where the Treaty of Union took place. The lead statue that we look upon is the statue to the Charles II. It started off as the Duke of Alba, and they finished up as Charles II. It's the oldest lead statue in Britain, and every 50 years, I believe, one of the legs has to be strengthened.
Back over the road, and we come to Edinburgh City Chambers. This used to be the home of the Scottish Bible Society.
Well, it's a very active society indeed. Send Bibles and Christian literature to many parts of the world, really. 200 years is a long time. I know Dr. Ferguson MacDonald quite well, and he eventually became Secretary of the International Bible Society. I think that's the name of it, but very well-known society indeed.
As we move down the Royal Mile, or High Street as it is sometimes known, we come to one of the many openings between the buildings. I asked Bill where the name Close comes from.
Well, the word close, it means to be closed, you see, to be closed at night. Whether that actually happened or not, I don't know, but that's the meaning of it, close, to close. On some of the entries to the wines and closes and vennels of the old town, they would be locked at night, such as Riddle's Court. Sometimes, you know, you're very well-to-do people there. Of course, in Edinburgh, you had the well-to-do people at the top. You could have a marquis and earl at the top, and down at the bottom you could have a chimney sweep, that sort of thing. But this is very typical of what Edinburgh would have looked like during the time of Knox and before, and after Knox for at least 200 years, perhaps even more. This is very, very typical of medieval Edinburgh. I believe that at the bottom of the close here would be where the merchant would have his store, and of course here the house and the shop. This is Mowbray House here, which is very possibly the oldest domestic dwelling in Edinburgh, one of the very few houses that escaped the ransacking of the city in 1542 with the rough wooing, which I'll mention later. Interestingly enough, this house here is where Daniel Defoe lived for about 2 years. He was sent up to Edinburgh by the English government prior to the Union of 1707, acting as a sort of a spy, sending back information to London. But Defoe actually met the prototype of Crusoe, Alexander Selkirk, in London, and wrote his famous book, Robinson Crusoe, around his exploits. Of course, there was no sanitation in these days during the time of Knox, and for hundreds of years afterwards. As a matter of fact, many of these tenements had water carriers whereby for so much a gallon you could get, say, a halfpenny a gallon, you could have water carried up to your flat or your apartment. Incidentally, the word flat was coined here in Edinburgh, and all sewage, of course, was thrown out of the window, and there must have been many a gentleman with a cocked hat going past with a shower of muck on his hat, etc., etc. Yes, Gardilou, which of course is a corruption of the French, look out for the water.
Just down from Trunk's Close, we come to John Knox's house. He did live here, but not for very long.
Well, John Knox died in this house here. There is no written evidence to that effect, but it is oral and traditional. It was the house of James Mossman, the court jeweller to James-V, the father of Mary Queen of Scots, and possibly to Mary of Guise-Lorraine, and for a short time, to Mary herself. The goldsmiths were actually money lenders, really, and John Knox, shortly before his death, I think it's possibly 18 months before his death, lived in the house. So he lived for a very short time here. The manse of St Giles was further up the street there, but it was demolished possibly 200 years ago. The Free Church of Scotland, of which I'm a member of, they actually saved the house from demolition in 1898, 1899. The idea was to widen the high street here, and the city fathers thought about demolishing the house, but the Free Church of Scotland stepped in and bought the house, and eventually it was given back to the local authority. The Free Church were very, very active in social life within the city itself. They did a tremendous work among the poor in the city, and indeed in saving some of the old buildings, although there was quite a problem between Dr. Begg and Lord Coburn. Lord Coburn wished to preserve buildings, whereas Dr. Begg wished to demolish them and build what was known as happy homes for working men. But the Free Church actually did save some buildings. They saved Murray House. Murray House was the first teacher training college for school teachers, and they also built Jordan Hill in Glasgow. Dr. Begg was responsible really largely for the building society schemes in Edinburgh. Indeed, the colonies in Stockbridge, as they are known, and the colonies in Abbey Hill were built by people who had influence and who were Free Church people and who knew Dr. Begg quite well. In the Cowgate here, there's a very fine Victorian building for working people known as Begg's Buildings. And in the colonies itself, there are street names like Kemp Place after George Meikle Kemp, the person who designed the Scott Monument, and Collins the printer. The Collins and Nelsons, the printing people, the publishing people, were actually Free Church people as well. The Free Church had a tremendous number of important people connected with them. People like Simpson of chloroform fame. I could go on and on and on. The president of Princeton of the day, Queen Victoria's Chamberlain, General Brisbane of Australia, who gave his name, the principals of Glasgow and Edinburgh universities, the Lord Provost of Edinburgh and Glasgow, and so on and so on and so on. Last night I was at a meeting to do with one of our people who was working in Iran, and I forgot to tell him that the first Parsi Christian missionary was actually associated with the Free Church. One of our famous missionaries was Dr. Duff, who founded the University of Calcutta, actually the first Presbyterian missionary to India. And another famous one was Robert Burns' nephew, who founded the University of Dunedin in New Zealand.
Robert Burns' nephew,
yes.
Robert Burns from here?
Robert Burns' nephew was Dr. Thomas Burns. He went out to New Zealand and established the Presbyterian congregation there as a missionary and founded the University of Dunedin.
A few paces further, we reached the world's end. A slight exaggeration, perhaps, but this point marked one of the gates of the original city. The outline of the gatehouse structure is marked out in a series of brass plates on the ground.
Well, the Netherbow Port was the principal gate to the city, and it was demolished about 1780, around about that time. A magnificent structure indeed. There would have been a watch kept at night, you see, and for people going in and out. But Edinburgh was becoming quite busy about that time, and unfortunately it was demolished.
That's the same year that Monboddo was writing about humans evolving from orangutan. We've got the curb just here. Well, here we are, Bill, and just behind us is the building of the Canongate Freemason Lodge. And this is quite a historical place here, because just down this street would have been people like Lord Monboddo, James Burnet, who was a High Court judge in the Enlightenment. He wrote about, in his book Ancient Metaphysics and others, he wrote about humans evolving from orangutans back in 1768, long before Charles Darwin. And of course those ideas, he said, came through the Greeks, and they were being discussed here at the time. He was in Scotland. Some of the Scottish people later on decided, when Darwinism became acceptable, that they would rather claim it from Monboddo. So there was a sort of eccentric poem which suited Monboddo. It was written by Lord Neves in 1875, and it said, "Though Darwin now proclaims the law and spreads it far abroad, the man that first the secret saw was honest old Monboddo. The architect precedence takes of him who bears the hoddo, so up and at him, land of cakes, will vindicate Monboddo." So an amusing sort of poetry about him. But he was rather eccentric, so I think people rather don't want to connect him with Darwinism or evolutionary thinking. But this Canongate Lodge was a site of when Robert Burns, a national poet, was given his title there, and sort of movers and shakers of society, who many of them were Freemasons, were there. People like Adam Smith, who wrote Wealth of the Nations, was also a Freemason here. So it was very influential. Have you got any other thoughts to what I've mentioned there, Bill?
Well, George Washington was a Freemason, and I think it was because of his contact with Freemasonry in Scotland that some of the older buildings in Washington were built by Scots Masons. There was a lull in the building of the new town, because the new town dates from 1767 onwards, and it's very possible that there were Scots Masons involved in the building of the White House. Indeed, Washington himself would have known Scotland very well, because as a young man he trained as a surveyor, and it was in the office of a Scotsman, I think possibly in Philadelphia, that he received his training, and the senior surveyor, or the owner of the business, was a Scotsman. I think his name possibly was Hume, from the Scottish border. His home originally would have been Paxton House, but the day that Washington was inaugurated President of the United States of America, the Guard of Honor was performed by 100 Gaelic-speaking Highlanders. And of course, during the American Revolution, there were Scots on both sides of the British government, and of course, many of the revolutionaries were Scots themselves, such as Patrick Henry. Patrick Henry's father was a Presbyterian minister from Aberdeen. So Presbyterianism had quite a big say in the formation of the United States. Indeed, Theodore Roosevelt, in his famous book, The Winning of the West, said that if it had not been for the Scots-Irish, meaning, of course, the Ulster Scots, that the revolution movement would not have got off the ground. The independence document itself was actually printed by a Scots publisher by the name of Dunlap.
There's also to mention from this lodge, Erasmus Darwin was also influenced by Lord Monboddo, and he was the grandfather of Charles Darwin, so there was quite a connection there. Yeah. But also James Hutton, who studied Arthur Seat up there, and was very influenced by that and thought, well, this is not thousands of years old as the traditional biblical understanding, but he thought it would be millions of years laid down in that process. So a lot of people were thinking about all sorts of ideas in the Enlightenment in the 18th century here, and it seems that most of the Enlightenment ideas were spread through the Freemason lodges because they opened their doors for that kind of thing. And so this place behind us was actually very influential in that time. What was it like for the Christians in the Enlightenment? I mean, because you often had the ministers, some of them were what they call the moderates and the high flyers. Could you mention something about that?
Well, not very much really, but I do know that the royal family for the last 150 years have been associated with Freemasonry himself. King Edward VII's Freemason's apron is in the Masonic building in George Street, the great building, wonderful building indeed it is, beautifully designed, and they have a museum there and they show all sorts of things including King Edward's apron, and I believe that the Duke of Windsor, King Edward VIII, the person who abdicated, was a Freemason as well, but I don't know much about Freemasonry, I'm sorry.
But, Debbie, what was it like for the Christians at the time of the Enlightenment? Because you have to bear in mind there was a revival of sort of Greek philosophical thought and all sorts of ideas and challenging the authority of the Bible.
It wouldn't have been easy for them at all, really, because if you are a committed Christian, quite honestly, I don't think that one could accept Freemasonry. If you were a committed Christian, it would be extremely difficult so to do. There'd be all sorts of problems, really. Is your allegiance to your Freemason brother, or is your allegiance to Christ? Or if you're employing someone, do you employ them because they're a Freemason? There's all that in it, and I certainly wouldn't have anything to do with it.
It was in that same period, wasn't it, of the Enlightenment that both George Whitefield and John Wesley came to preach here in Edinburgh.
Yes.
And caused quite a stir, didn't they? Right in the midst of, I think, when morality was plummeting, because I think the average person on the street was confused about what was right and wrong. Things were open for discussion. Often ministers in the pulpit would prefer to preach from a philosophical work rather than the Bible. So into the midst of that, you had George Whitefield and John Wesley came preaching and stirring things up. Have you a few comments about that, maybe, what they did?
Well, they made a tremendous impression in Edinburgh. Whitefield actually preached on the site of the of Her Majesty's Register House at the east end of Prince Street. That was an open ground at the time of Whitefield, and Wesley himself preached on the Magdalen Chapel, I believe. But well, then, you know, we had the 1843 disruption quite a number of years after that, which again was just turmoil and much persecution. It was either your job or your church, that sort of thing. And indeed, some of the well-educated people lost their sinecure at one of the professors at the University of Aberdeen lost his professorship because of his allegiance to the evangelical cause. And again, now wait a moment now. Yes, Dr. David Welch, who was Secretary of the National Bible Society of Scotland at the time, he lost everything really because of his interest in the evangelical cause within the Church of Scotland. It was really quite a sad time in many ways, and people were confused because of Darwinism and creationism and all that sort of thing.
Quite a topic these days, isn't it?
It certainly is, and as I mentioned,
century Edinburgh.
And as I mentioned before, it was really in Edinburgh that Darwin received much of his thinking about creationism. A doctor in Leith had influenced him. I think I've probably mentioned that before. Darwin was at the university here for some time.
And I think he did field trips, didn't he, on Arthur's Seat?
Yes, he did.
So he was influenced by Hutton's thinking before about the rocks.
That's right. And the first edition of Hutton's great book, I think it's called The Theory of the Rocks. I'm not just quite sure about the title.
Rather long and a hefty tome, wasn't it?
A very, very hefty tome, large tome, and it's now in the New College Library, where they, of course, have extremely valuable and important works.
Didn't John Playfair have to rewrite it because to make it more manageable for the average, even intellectual reader?
Yes, well, Hutton was a very brilliant man, really. He lived for a while in the Cowgate, actually, and then I believe he lived for a while down at Cameron Toll. the building still stands. It's now part of the doctor's surgery there, James Hutton's house. But a very brilliant man, really, in many ways, I would say, sort of forgotten. His importance isn't really quite realised, I would certainly think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because James Hutton's book, which was redone by John Playfair, then it was Lyell, wasn't it, later, another Scotsman,
Yes.
who wrote about the theory of the rocks, and it was Charles Darwin actually read the copy of James Lyell's book when he was on his famous voyage on the HMS Beagle,
on the Beagle,
which really prepared him, I think. I think it's probably a mixture of what he learnt from the Enlightenment here in Edinburgh, followed by his voyage on the HMS Beagle, coupled together with the writings of Lyell, which have been influenced in turn by Hutton. And that, of course, shaped a lot of his thinking and prepared the way for our modern society today.
Yes, and of course, you know, during the Scottish Enlightenment, you had great men like Adam Smith, probably one of the most important men in history, really. The monetary system of the Western world is based on his theory, the wealth of nations. And I think it has been said that the three nations in the world who've done more for mankind than any other are the Jewish people because of the Bible, the Greeks because of democracy, and the Scots because of their intellectual interests and their inventiveness. And I would say that the European Enlightenment basically established itself from Edinburgh and then spread throughout the Western world. I'm sure there's no doubt about that whatever.
A little further down the road we come to Canongate Kirk. This is the place of worship for the royal family when they are visiting Holyrood Palace, and a recent venue for the royal wedding. It is also the final resting place for a number of famous Edinburgh citizens.
Joseph Bell was very possibly the model or prototype for Conan Doyle's Sherlock Holmes. Joseph Bell lectured at the university too, as well as a surgeon, and Conan Doyle got hold of his papers, researched them, and wrote his famous stories around his experiences. One of Joseph Bell's cures was mouldy cheese, which was a pointer to penicillin. That family came from Dumfriesshire, actually, from the Blackett, a small estate called Blackett, Blackett Tower. Bell actually means La Belle, the fair one. It's Norman French, a very, very ancient family, and they moved up here in around about, I think, 1800. Joseph Bell had 9 brothers and sisters. He was the eldest of the family, and I think his grandfather's eldest son was his father, you see, and he had died, and young Joseph inherited the Blackett estate, which was sold, and they came up to Edinburgh here, and they purchased land in the Newington area and lived at Newington House. Very interesting, I often think.
So here we are in the Canongate Kirk graveyard, and down here is the memorial stone to Horatius Bonar. Could you mention something about that?
Well, there were 2 brothers, 2 famous brothers, Church of Scotland ministers, who came into the Free Church in 1843, Horatius Bonar and Andrew Bonar, friends of Mary McChain, the godly minister who died in March 1843. I think probably we've mentioned him before. Horatius Bonar was minister of the Chalmers Memorial Church, now St Catherine Argyll Church in Grange Road, just opposite the Grange Cemetery. He was a very godly man and a wonderful hymn writer. I think probably one of his most famous hymns would have been I heard the voice of Jesus say, come unto me and rest. Lay down thy weary one, lay down thy head upon my breast. I came to Jesus as I was, weary and full of care. I found in him a resting place, and he has made me glad. The day that he died, 2 of his elders met on the street, and one said to the other, I hear that Dr. Bonar went to heaven today, And the one said to the other, well, he didn't have far to go. He was such a godly man. He was always preaching, always visiting, always writing, always praying. He was a very fine man indeed, Horatius Bonar.
The kirk itself has a lot of history attached to it, so I asked Bill to tell us more about it.
The congregation of the Canongate Kirk would originally have worshipped in the Chapel Royal at Holyrood. It was quite intact then. The mob, actually, the Edinburgh mob, entered the Royal Chapel in 1688 and ransacked it and almost ruined it. But prior to that, the congregation would have worshipped there, the Presbyterian congregation. And when James, Duke of York, the brother of Charles II, came to Scotland as governor, he had the congregation ejected from the Chapel Royal. Now, there was money available to build a church, and through a mortification trust, as mentioned on the slab above the main doorway there. So the church would have been established sometime in the 1680s, but was not completed until after the abdication of James VII II in 1688 through the Glorious Revolution. And the church was finished during the reign of William of Orange, and I believe that part of his coat of arms is on the building at the front there. Just above the window are the royal coat of arms, and above that is the crest of the Canon Gate, the antlers, horns, and the cross. Now, the tradition is that in round about the first quarter of the 12th century, King David I was hunting in the great forest of Drumsheugh, which covered practically the whole of the area that we know as Edinburgh today. It would have been part of the Great Caledonian Forest, which covered a very large part of Scotland. And as he was hunting quite near where the chapel and palace are today, the tradition or legend is that a great white stag came out of the forest and almost gored him, almost attempted to gore him to death or to injure him in some way. And at the moment of the stag appearing, there was a cross, according to legend, appeared between the antlers of the stag. And David's life was saved, and he said that he would build a church or a monastery on that site. Now, that is one tradition. The other tradition is that one of the items that Margaret, the Hungarian princess, who actually was the true heir after her brother's death to the old Anglo-Saxon kingdom of England, had brought with her from Hungary part of the true cross. And it was enclosed within a jeweled cross of some sort. And it was actually lost at the Battle of Neville's Cross by David II. Yes, by David II, who would have been the son of Robert the Bruce. Now, the tradition is that the cross itself was kept at Holyrood, hence the name Holy Cross. Now, it depends which one of you accept. Do you accept the fact that David had this mirage of seeing the cross between the antlers, or do you accept the tradition that it was Margaret's cross, which would have been a reliquary of the pre-Reformation church? Either one. But today it is the church in which the Queen worships on the Sunday. It was originally St Giles that the monarchs resided when they stayed in the palace here, but the Queen now worships in the Canongate Kirk. Canongate, or Canoned Walk. The gate is an old Scots word for a walk, and it would appear that the masons who built Holyrood Abbey in the 12th century, that they stayed in the castle, and this would have been their walk, you see, back and forward at night and in the morning. I don't really know much about the historical personages associated with the church, except that, am I right in saying that Whitfield worshipped
Whitfield,
George Whitfield. On my left here is the presumed grave of David Rizzio, Mary Queen of Scots' secretary, who was murdered at Holyrood. Mary and David Rizzio were great friends. Mary, of course, spoke fluent Latin and French, as did David Rizzio. He also spoke Italian, and Mary had good Italian as well. She was a very, very well-educated princess. And when James VII became Duke of York, the tradition is that he had the remains of David Rizzio removed from the royal vault where Mary had him buried, and buried here in the Canongate.
Well, we're coming near to the bottom of the Royal Mile now, and just behind us is the Holyrood Palace, and a lot of history there. Think of John Knox, Mary Queen of Scots, and other famous people. Would you like to tell us something about the foundation of the Holyrood Abbey and then the palace, and what happened later in the Reformation?
Well, the Abbey was founded between 1124 and 1138 by King David I, as already mentioned. Much of it was destroyed in 1542 with what was known as the Rough Wooing. Henry VIII wished his son, Prince Edward, who became Edward VI, to marry the young Queen of Scots. She would just be a very small child, but it was hoped that through this marriage the two kingdoms would be united. But the Scots lords were very much out of favour with that, because they knew very well that once Henry got the young Queen of Scots, Mary Stuart, into his hands, that would be the last of Scotland as an independent kingdom. And he tried to rough up the Scots, hence known as the Rough Wooing. Now, in 1542, 1544 and 1547, his army came into Edinburgh and did a lot of damage, and set fire to the abbey and stole quite a lot of artifacts from the building, including a great lectern which was taken down to St Albans, which happily was restored to Edinburgh some years ago. The abbey today has what's known as the Royal Vault. Queen Victoria was always very interested in her Scottish ancestors and what was left of the remains of some of the Scottish kings that were buried in the abbey. She had collected and put into a large box and buried in a very ugly vault on the right-hand side of the Chapel Royal. But the abbey itself is only a very small part of the original abbey that one would have seen it well over the centuries. The royal family always had lodgings in the abbeys, and when James IV was to marry Margaret Tudor, he married Margaret Tudor actually in 1503, who was the daughter of Henry VII, King of England. This was quite a catch for the Tudors, because the Tudors were actually a very modern or a very new dynasty compared to the Stuarts, who had ruled Scotland from the time of Robert Bruce's grandson. Now, in those days marriages took a long time to negotiate, especially international marriages of great importance that sometimes took years to arrange. And James IV, King of Scots, in 1499 to 1503, built onto the abbey a little palace, really as a principal residence for Margaret Tudor and himself. One must remember that the castle was still in use as a royal residence in those days. However, when James V married Mary of Guise, Lorraine, the mother of Mary, Queen of Scots, possibly in the late 1530s. I might be wrong in the date, but certainly about that time. The tower here that we see on our left, known as the James V Tower, was erected, and these were the personal apartments of Mary, Queen of Scots. Now, by 1650, the palace was quite extensive. As it was so in 1603, it was to the old palace of Holyrood that Sir Robert Cary came from Richmond Palace in London in 1603 with an emerald ring. He came up to the door of the palace and wakened the porter, said that the Queen of England had died. That was Queen Elizabeth, Tudor Elizabeth I, and that he was now King of England. Because this was a great thing for James. It was riches beyond the dreams of avarice. But in 1650, Cromwell's troops were billeted in the old palace, and they set fire to it accidentally. There was still a part of the palace left. However, in 1671, it was decided by King Charles II that a new palace should be built. And the present palace that we see today is largely the work of Sir William Bruce and of Milne, the architect in Scotland. It is probably the finest 17th century palace in the United Kingdom, because it stood still for so many years. Now, in 1796, the exiled royal family of France, the Comte d'Artois, the young brother of Louis XVI, went into exile, came here for safety, he and his family, and they resided in the palace for a number of years. Quite interestingly enough, in 1831, the family came back. He came back as Charles X, King of France, with his grandson, Le Comte de Chambord, who succeeded him as the titular Henri V. Now, in 1822, the palace was quite famous. King George IV was the first of the Hanoverian kings to visit the palace. Although he didn't reside there, he resided at Dalkeith Palace. Now, we should really go back to the 16th century, and it was in Mary Queen of Scots' apartments that John Knox had at least 3 interviews with Mary Queen of Scots, and she gave him on one of the occasions a watch, or really a small clock, which is still in existence today. Poor Mary, one of the most highly educated princesses in Europe, a very tall, beautiful woman. She was 6 feet in height, auburn hair, the auburn hair of the Tudors, the dark brown eyes of the Tudors, a very good-looking woman, married first of all to Francis II of France, married to a wretched man called Henry Stuart, a second cousin, Lord Darnley, then married to the Earl of Bothwell. She was a tragic figure caught up in the Scottish Reformation. She really was, according to the Catholic monarchs, and that could be possible, the true heir to the Kingdom of England. You see, Elizabeth Tudor was said by the Catholic monarchs to be illegitimate. She was conceived before marriage. Her mother was Anne Boleyn. And of course, on the death of Henry VIII, he was succeeded by his son, Prince Edward, whose mother was Jane Seymour, and then by Mary, known as Bloody Mary, whose mother was Catherine of Aragon. She had the better claim, and then, of course, by Elizabeth Tudor, who was, as I said before, illegitimate, having been conceived before marriage, whereas Mary was the great-granddaughter of Henry VII, and therefore, in the bloodline, she had possibly a better claim. Hence this tremendous turmoil between Protestantism and Catholicism. Poor Mary, she was 19 years in prison in England. I also feel very sorry for her. I felt that she was in many ways a spiritually minded woman, and had she been courted better by Knox, things might have turned out a little better. Her last words before being executed were, "To thee, O Lord, I commit my soul. In my end is my beginning." And I often think that you couldn't have said that if you did not have some deep spiritual faith. She is the progenitor, of course, of the present royal house and many of the royal houses in Europe.
As we approach Holyrood Palace, we come to what is known as Mary Queen of Scots bathhouse, although it seems a strange place to want to take a bath.
Well, there is actually a stone trough in it, but it was one of 4 guard gates, so to speak. built in the middle of the 16th century, presumably. It's the only one that's remaining now. I believe that many, many years ago it was thatched originally, and when the present slates were put on after the thatch, that a dagger was found in the thatch, which may have been deposited there by one of the murderers of Henry Lord Darnley, the second husband of Mary Queen of Scots. As they came through from the murder, one of them possibly threw it into the thatch to hide it. But that's all I know about it. But my boys used to call it the witch's house.
Today, Holyrood Park is frequented by tourists and joggers, but it used to have another function.
Well, Bill, we've got something down here in brass. It's 3 S's along the line here towards the palace. Can you tell us what this S signifies?
Well, S means sanctuary. Up to 1850, there were little houses all over the park whereby people could reside for a small sum of money. There was a curfew. One had to be in by a certain time at night, but most of the day would have been freedom, you see. It was mainly for petty crimes such as debt, etc., etc. And Queen Victoria's first visit to the Palace of Holyrood House was in 1842. And after that, it was thought that these little refuge houses should be demolished, except for this one here on the left, which is late 16th, early 17th century. The story is that a man was being chased down, say, at 10:05 by the city officer or city bailiff, and he tripped and fell over the marker, you see, and his head was over the marker and his legs were into the less safe area. And as the bailiff pulled him back, he said, "Leave me alone, it was my head that committed the crime, not my legs."
Well, thank you very much, Bill Anderson, for an amazing amount of information. And we've only just really touched the surface, haven't we? It's
absolutely,
like
yes.
Tip of the iceberg. And you think there's so much. We started up by the Royal Mile and the other bits as well. And we go through stages of history before the Middle Ages, go right through the Reformation, Covenanters, the time of the Enlightenment and Wesley and Whitfield, and then 19th century amazing things, disruption, and so on, right through to the present day. And here we have modern day Edinburgh, 21st century, and so many people are just unaware of the rich heritage they have, and how we would long that people will actually know something of the heritage, especially the spiritual heritage. And we think that the gospel of Christ has been preached from this street and this city for a long time, and transformed the lives of thousands, that Jesus Christ is alive today in the 21st century as he was and always has been, affecting the lives of people today.